The Legend of Zelda series has interested me for a while ever since I became interested in gaming, but never been in a game from the franchise before. My first experience with the games include Twilight Princess HD, Wind Waker HD, and Hyrule Warriors for the 3DS. I didn't play much of them due to my old habits back then, in which I got stuck and never played them again. With the Switch era, I started with Breath of the Wild, which I consider to be an important part of my hobby and how I would see video games today, and I would consider it to be a top 5 game for me when I played it. I never beaten it because of the old habits, but I sometimes want to go back and beat it, but the game world make me feel overwhelmed. The Link's Awakening remake was the first 2D Zelda game, and I was close to beating that one, but the final boss was annoying, so I stopped. And finally, with Age of Calamity, it was a Warriors game that uses Breath of the Wild to tell its story. The plot felt lackluster, and it didn't bring much new as it is a mix of Warriors and Breath of the Wild, and I luckily managed to beat it. But I don't think it's a real Zelda game though. But now with Skyward Sword HD, I managed to get it for my birthday and haven't played it until mid-November, and I have some stuff to say about this experience. As of December 2021, this is the last traditional 3D Zelda game to release, which started on the Wii on November 18th of 2011. And almost 10 years later, it came to Switch with some enhancements and was released on July 16th of 2021. Both games were well received and people do enjoy them, but from what I played, I think it's overrated to some extent, and I got some evidence to prove it. This is the myth, the legend, Skyward 5, and this is my video essay on The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD and why it's an overrated game to some extent. We will be only looking at the Switch version, so anything mentioned from the Wii will not be mentioned here. And with that out of the way, let's start.
One thing that will motivate you on your journey is the plot, but it's very basic. Early on, you were awakened by Zelda, who's a childhood friend of Link in this game, and was asked to join the annual wing ceremony in Skyloft, which is the game's hub world. After the search of Link's loft wing, which is a large bird based off the shoe bill, the ceremony finally begins and Link wins, which should be no surprise since Link is the main character in the Zelda series. And afterwards, he and Zelda went flying and a big tornado took Zelda away. You would then wake up from a dream of Zelda getting eaten by a monster in that tornado. You would then hear a mysterious voice, which would end up being this character named Fee, and she asks you to take the sword and begin the journey. In the first dungeon, you will meet the person responsible for taking Zelda in that tornado, who calls himself Grimahem. Throughout the first few dungeons, you would see Zelda, but she looked busy with another person. This would have been Impa. More time has passed and you would meet Zelda at the Gate of Time, which then Grimahem started some conflict, and before Zelda left, you would be given the goddess's heart from Zelda. There's another gate in time in which he can use to look for Zelda, but his sword needs to be much more powerful in order to use it. An old woman you would meet early on said you would need to look for the scared flames, which would have helped you become much more powerful. After fighting them, you would go back and started to unlock this new gate of time. You used it and find Zelda, which she's in the past. Once you found her, she would rather stay due to how she is the reincarnated goddess Hylia, and told Link that she must protect the past by sleeping to keep the evil forces of Demis in prison. She said goodbye and told Link to look for the Triforce to defeat Demis and the Demon King. Emotions happen and Link goes on and finds the Triforce, which he does, and he and Zelda meet again, but break it up by Grimahem, in which he took Zelda and resurrected Demon King, and the last few fights happen. After you defeat Demis, Zelda is saved, Fee finally goes away, the old woman dies, and Zelda decides to stay on the ground, and the game ends. The story itself, on paper, is very basic with how they handle the plot. It's a save the princess story, which is very Legend of Zelda to do so. Not saying that's a bad thing, but it's too vague and generic. But they executed better by how they gave the world and characters much more lore to make it much more interesting. The characters are basic and just do what they are supposed to do, with some exceptions. You have Zelda, who is the end goal reward, Link, the speaking disorder protagonist, and other characters that include Impa, that old lady in the Seal Grounds, and the father of Zelda, which help guide the characters on what they need to do next in the plot. Other characters include Groose, who I'm assuming is the comedy relief character, but he feels more like a bully early on, and after a while with the old lady, he becomes a person who has his life set in stone in the temple. I know he's a fan favorite, but there's not much to him unless we're talking about the comedy stuff. You also have Grinsham, who is the game's villain and acted like a massive dick throughout. And then you have Fee,
who companions you throughout the game, and she has no fucking personality, and all she does is say, Master Link, it looks like the exit's gone. There's a 94% chance that the story-related item is in there. And she only exists as a guide for Link to get through the dungeons and fights, but they could have made the character more useful than just dancing around the ancient grounds and religious places. While you explore the world, aka there's only like 3, each world has its own group of species, which is cool to see to some extent. For the grass world, you have chocolate chicken balls. In the lava world, you have some 90s kids show characters that are very expressive when they speak. And in the desert world, you have robots that exist only in the past. Other characters from Skyloft also apply here. There's also more important characters, but I think you get the point. Most of these characters serve their purpose as expected, which isn't a bad thing, but I do think that the writing could have been much better, as there's just saying the basic stuff and isn't really engaging the player for the most part. Maybe Grinsham had somewhat interesting dialogue, but he sounded like the already mentioned dick he is. Overall, the story itself does its job at giving the player a goal while playing this adventure, with basic characters that tell the story just alright. Although yes, the story has gotten more complex in terms of purpose and why the princess is like this, and why there's a threat, but I do think that it's just done the bare minimum in terms of storytelling personally. Let's talk about the main core of the adventure, and that is the gameplay, which hasn't aged well even though the game came out 10 years ago. This was originally released for the Wii, and when they tried to port it, they did what they could with the controls. Normally in a video game, you would use the face buttons or the back ones to perform action. In this game, basic sword combat is used with the R stick, which is not normal by any means, since it's used to control the camera in most cases. But how you control the camera now, since the R stick is to use the basic weapons, just press L and move with R stick. And at first, it needs some time to get used to, as this game feels completely different than other games in terms of control setup. Let's now talk about what you'll be doing in this game. If you know how a regular Zelda game works, then it shouldn't be too different. That being, it's a game in which you would do fetch quests in a world, and then you would do dungeons with puzzles to do and bosses to fight. The main world stuff is usually just doing chores to get to certain locations or important items that are related to the story. Although this is fine, the game itself has too much of them. Chores themselves are always the same type, such as a collectathon, which you have to get multiple groups of characters or a certain amount of items, or it can just be give a character an item to do things because some are too lazy to do it or sick, like the electric dragon. I'm not saying this stuff is bad by any means, but it's repetitive every time to get to a dungeon. But there are other stuff that would happen that's more story related, but I'll discuss that in a few minutes. It's time to discuss the dungeons, which are the bread and butter of the Zelda series. Like I already mentioned, these are big places that are filled with enemies to fight, puzzles to do, and unique bosses to defeat. I can really see why these could be popular. They have moments of slow-paced adventuring, but also moments of action-packed aggressive fights against big foes. No offense to Big Cheesy. These areas will introduce new items that will help you on your journey to save Zelda, such as the basic bow and arrow and bombs. Some items you may recognize from the Smash Bros. Series make an appearance here, as they originally are from this game, such as the Wind Thing and the Beetle, which can fly into the air and hit switches or drop bombs to enemies. No offense to World War II. The bosses themselves would require the new items you got from the dungeon to expose their weaknesses. Most of the early bosses aren't too special, but they get better once you know how this game would work. One boss I do like is the one where you have to whip his arms out with the whip you got from the dungeon. And a dungeon I think is the best is the last one, due to how it managed to pack in everything you learn into one place and how it is connected by this fun puzzle that connects the rooms together, and its overall well-paced dungeon to end the game. After the dungeons, you would go up to Skyloft and other worlds connecting to it. Using your loft wing to fly around will feel natural after a couple of hours and can be cool, but the game plays the exact same song every goddamn time. The song itself is good, but they could have added a little variety with the music. Also, it repeats itself every time you land. Skyloft is what I consider a hub world, in which it has characters to see, side quests to do, and a marketplace to restock on items, upgrade weapons, store your items since you can't hold all of them at once, and potions to help give Link boosts and stuff like strength, heart, stamina, and other things. One criticism I do have with Skyloft is that certain items you can't sell, like bugs or materials. The game always gives you 1 to 5 rubies and sometimes 10 in the areas, and those aren't really enough to buy many of the stuff that the shops sell you. I'm not sure if I'm missing something or I'm just blind, but it would have been nice to sell stuff too. earn more money. Skyloft has many secrets and some exploration to it, which help keep things interesting sometimes. In the world, you will find these large blocks called goddess cubes. When you hit it with a Skyward Strike, which is a sword move that you hold up with the R stick, it would send up into the air and you can open a treasure chest in the sky that is glowing. And rewards for opening these chests would include heart pieces, money, or other useful items. Other places in the sky include the Lumpy Pumpkin, which is a restaurant home to the side quests, and you would come back for the story. And there's the Isle of Songs, which you would go into this big cloud wall and it would be home to a big puzzle and you would go there to learn new songs for your harp. You get it from Zelda and its purpose is to sing songs to locate areas and silent realms, which I'll discuss in a second. There's a few other places you can visit, but I think this is the most of the important stuff. Silent realms are these places that help discover where the Scare Flames are, important to the story. These sections are more of a time travel mode in which you have to get 15 of these flower petals, and if you get spotted, you're on high alert and you would have to get a petal in order to reset everything, and if you get hit, it's game over. You don't have your weapons or useful items, so it's more of a stealth-based mission to get through these things. There's 4 of these realms, one in the desert area, grass area, lava area, and Skyloft, and all are mandatory for the plot. Speaking of these worlds, you have only 3, the wood, desert, and lava. Each have their own sub-areas and have their own species of characters that I probably already mentioned, and each world has its own unique features to make it stand out, such as the desert world where you have the time shift stones and those could have an impact on the world and help with puzzles, and other fun stuff such as riding across the sea or following a minecart to search for a way to continue. With all of these gameplay stuff, the game does a decent job at making things consistent, which can be a good and bad thing. It helps players to know what to expect going forward until more plot is revealed. On the other hand, it can feel boring or unexciting for some who want to be surprised on every corner. There are other stuff I could talk about with the game, such as the large monster fights that happen 3 times, or other gameplay stuff, but I do think that you can get the point for the most part. And to end the game are 2 fights, the third encounter with Grinsham and one with Demis, the final boss. I thought that these were going to be bad fights, but it ended up becoming good boss fights. To end this long segment, the gameplay can be overwhelming. If this is your first 3D Zelda game, the controls can be an issue for some, and non-dungeon areas for the most part aren't fun and can feel like a chore. Some other issues include certain stuff can't be sold from my understanding, and the pacing is way too consistent, which can be good for some since you know what to expect when playing this game often, but it doesn't add surprises to make the player engage a little bit more. The dungeons are a highlight of the game, and some bosses can be really fun. While the gameplay itself has some stuff that makes it work, other things just make this game questionable in certain situations. The developers know how to make the game look good by knowing how to make it playable. Graphically, it has more of a watercolor-inspired art style with very soft colors, which help the environments to become more rich in detail. This HD remaster port thing did help make it more crisp. As for music, they have some great scores and overworld themes, with some standard Zelda soundtrack stuff like opening the chest. Other stuff like the world themes make sense, but others like battling enemies feel too basic. A highlight for this category would be when you're flying with your Loftwing, as it does a good job at representing a flying adventure even though you're only going up there just to one location to the next, and how they play it way too often, which can get annoying if you don't care for it. But last is the frame rate, the technical stuff when it comes to games. This game ran pretty smooth for me and it wasn't an issue, but there were a few section delays on stuff like the music with dungeon exploring. According to Eurogamer, it is stated that the Switch port is a locked 60 frames per second, which is impressive, but we're talking about an HD port of a Wii game, but still. Presentation isn't anything to write home about, but they managed to make it better than what they already have with the Wii. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD isn't the best game out there, but it does have many good moments that do help the game succeed. Although on paper the story sounds really basic, but they gave even more detail to help it become more fleshed out. Characters can be a hit or miss depending on what you're looking for. Some can be cool, others can just exist for the story. Or if you like Fi, you just annoy the fuck out of Link. The controls are not normal, and that will make some folks confused if they don't know what a Wii is. Gameplay can have some great moments like the dungeons and certain boss fights, especially in the later half of the game. But the in-between isn't all that much to write home about and can feel like a chore sometimes, even if it's a part of the story. And with many quality of life stuff that needs to be improved, this is why I say the game is slightly overrated than what most people think. If you're willing to put up with the controls and other stuff, you can find enjoyment in this game. I would give it a 7.3 out of 10. Although good, it has several flaws that would bother some people. This has been the first Zelda game I have beaten, and I think it should be an accomplishment. Besides me not saving the game as a hero mode file, which is a harder difficulty, this game did what it can to satisfy people. Let's hit the skies and go to Skyloft. No offense to airplanes.
It's a wonderful day to go out and play. Hey, maybe you could come along. All you need to bring is a song to sing.